Welcome to Holy Smoke, the Spectator's religion podcast. I'm Damian Thompson. An earthquake has hit English Christianity with the resignation of the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, who has decided to quit his post following a damning report into a prolific child abuser who is associated with the Church of England. He was called John Smyth. He's been dead for a few years now. Whose ministry centred on various summer camps and also Winchester College in this country and also Africa, where he was conveniently banished, involved beating and whipping boys mercilessly for their sins with very troubling sexual overtones. He moved in the same circles as Justin Welby. There is absolutely no suggestion that Archbishop Welby was complicit in any of his crimes. But nonetheless, when Welby took over in 2013, he was told about Smyth and did nothing. And indeed waited several years before meeting Smyth's victims. And he now says that he is standing down in the best interests of the Church of England. I'm joined now by the editor of The Spectator, Michael Gove, to discuss this astonishing development. Michael, the resignation of the Archbishop of Canterbury is not just a shocking moment in the history of the Church of England, but really in the history of English Christianity. And let me start by asking you, do you think that Justin Welby has done the right thing?
I think he has. I think it was a very finely balanced decision for him, and he clearly agonised over it. But I think ultimately his position had become untenable for a variety of reasons. And I say that with regret, because I certainly found Justin Welby, in all my dealings with him when I was in government and subsequently, to be a kindly, holy and well-intentioned individual. However, it is the case that the revelations in the Macon report and the series of opportunities that there were to have dealt more effectively with this horrific abuser, John Smyth, the fact that the opportunity was not taken earlier, the fact that this abuser's crimes were not addressed earlier, the trail does lead back to the Archbishop's door in a way which meant that a variety of priests in the Church of England, including, of course, the Bishop of Newcastle, came to the conclusion that he couldn't carry on, having lost the confidence of so many, and without a very convincing account of why he hadn't acted earlier. Ultimately, I fear that Justin had to go.
Justin Welby had a lot of explaining to do for two reasons, really. The first, obviously, is his failure to act when he was told about the behaviour of this monstrous figure, John Smyth, in 2013, when he became Archbishop of Canterbury. But also the finger of suspicion, not, of course, of collusion, but of suspicion perhaps of concealing something, has been pointed at Justin Welby because he comes from the very same specific ecclesiastical subculture that John Smyth came from. That is public school, disciplinarian, muscular Christianity, a particularly English and even upper class abuse of spiritual power. Justin Welby knew Smyth as a young man and is reported by some to have had conversations about the rumours which swirled around Smyth's head for many, many years before he was packed off to Africa. But nonetheless, there's no real evidence of culpability attached to Justin Welby during those years. He wasn't even ordained at that time. He was a young man. But then there is the failure after he was warned in 2013, or he was presented with evidence of the horrendous nature of the beatings with the sadomasochistic sexual religious overtones. Why do you think he did nothing?
It's very difficult to know precisely. I think you are right that Archbishop Justin and this abuser Smyth were part of a shared culture, a shared approach. The camps, which were Smyth's hunting ground, as it were designed explicitly for the evangelical wing within the Church of England to attract, recruit and train leaders of the future, often from public schools, and Justin Welby was very much part of that culture, and I suspect that he will have found it very, very painful to have acknowledged that a movement of which he was both a mover and a beneficiary had been the place where Smyth did these terrible things. I think it's also the case that he would have thought, perhaps post-2013, that this was a matter principally for the police rather than necessarily for him. But it does seem to be the case that, upon reflection, he must have felt that not to fully acknowledge the scale of these crimes and not to have taken steps earlier meant that it was difficult for him to operate with the degree of credibility and authority that the role requires. And again, if you are Archbishop of Canterbury, I think it's different from, leading a church is different from leading many other institutions. It's not just efficiency and effectiveness by which you will be judged, it's also moral authority. And the moral authority, not the personal morality of the Archbishop, but the moral authority of his role was undoubtedly harmed by the concerns at his inattention and failure to take sufficiently seriously the information that came to him in his office.
And there's a further irony that when Justin Welby was appointed to the job, everybody was very interested in the fact that he'd been the treasurer of a major corporation, that he worked in the city before he was even a Christian. And therefore people expected a sort of Rolls Royce of managerial efficiency from him. In fact, what has happened is that on this specific issue of safeguarding and many others, we've been faced with such a degree of administrative chaos that I find it hard to keep track of all the different bodies and advisory panels that have been set up by the Church of England under Welby to try and deal with this question of safeguarding. But one thing that did happen, for example, last year, is that the Church of England sacked a panel of experts who provided independent oversight of how it dealt with abuse. And the experts who belonged to the Independent Safeguarding Board, set up by the Archbishop's Council, said in April last year, according to the BBC, that the Church had refused to share data with them and even denied them their own computers. And since then there's been another report, big report, by Professor Alexis Jay, who recommends a total overhaul of the Church of England's safeguarding structures, and one which would actually take the supervision of safeguarding away from the diocese, away from Lambeth Palace. There's been specific criticism that Lambeth Palace is so loosely and carelessly organised that it would be one of the easiest places, public institutions in the country, for a predator to take advantage of.
Yes, you're absolutely right that one of the things that people associated with Archbishop Justin was a greater degree of managerial efficiency. And indeed, putting the issue of safeguarding to one side just for a second, it is the case that some of the resistance to him from within the Church of England came from those people who believed that his whole approach was too managerial and insufficiently supportive of the individual work of parish priests and vicars, and that there was an attempt to, in effect, turn the Church of England into a corporation rather than a parochially based, diocesanly led, living movement for Christian evangelism. On the specific issue of safeguarding, I think you're absolutely right. I think that this is a problem with which many churches have wrestled. On the one hand, there is an awareness of sin and a desire also to believe in forgiveness and redemption, obviously. But if you're running an organization where adults can have access to children and young people at a vulnerable stage in their life, and that access can often be of a kind that gives the adult a position of authority and leadership and intimacy, then you do have to take these questions much more seriously than they appear to have been taken in the past.
You refer to Justin Welby running the church as a corporation. I've been very struck by the ferocity, the justified ferocity, I think, of the criticisms levelled at him by, for example, such an eminently wise figure as the Reverend Marcus Walker, rector of St. Bartholomew the Great, who has written a very powerful piece in this week's Spectator, he has consistently talked about the way that parishes being bled dry to fund a vastly swollen administrative structure that just doesn't seem to work. And one of the criticisms that's been made of failures of safeguarding is that things were set up in a hurry. And in that light, it seems perhaps less surprising that Welby should have failed to grapple with the problem of this man Smyth, whose crimes had been committed rather a long time ago and who had been rather conveniently moved to Africa. But what does seem indefensible, and a number of leading Anglicans have pointed this out, is Welby's reluctance to meet the victims. Though he was asked for years to talk to the victims of this man Smyth, who did horrible, almost unbelievably sadistic things to these boys. People knew about it, and they shifted him off to Africa so he could do it to boys in another country. And Welby resisted meeting the victims and has not explained why.
Yes, you are right. So the first thing to say is that Marcus Walker's very powerful piece, which we carry on the website, begins with quoting from the report, which reveals to the world just how horrific Smyth's crimes were, and it's very, very difficult reading for anyone. And you are also right that Smyth being dispatched or exiled to Africa, to Zimbabwe, and then South Africa seems to have been a grave dereliction. The decision by the Archbishop not to meet the victims, I'm told by his friends, was because he believed or was told that this might in some way interfere with or impede appropriate police and other investigations.
Of which there were not actually any current at the time, apparently.
But I can understand why anyone in public office might have been wary about what the prosecuting authorities may or may not do. But it would seem to me to be the case that given the horrific nature of those crimes and given that they were committed by someone who was acting at the time within the structures and with the support of the Church of England, that the leader of the Church of England would have been well advised to have listened humbly to those victims and then to have been as eager as possible to secure justice and restitution for them.
You refer to the Archbishop of Canterbury as being somebody in public office, which of course he always has been, but as one has watched support ebb away from Justin Welby over the last few days, people fail to say supportive things, people briefing against him, it's been just like a politician whose resignation a few days down the line everybody knows is inevitable. And it does rather remind one that the job of Archbishop of Canterbury, and indeed the job of religious leaders generally, has become increasingly politicised, and people therefore react to their performance in the job rather more as they might react to that of a politician.
I think that is absolutely true. So whatever the specifics in Archbishop Justin's case, it is undoubtedly the case that leadership in religious organisations now is much more difficult, and there are particular challenges. It's not unique to the Church of England, but particular challenges in the Church of England. The Church of England's very foundation, the Elizabethan settlement, was one where the Church contained within it those who still believed themselves to be Catholics, those who were Calvinists, and a broad mass in between. 400 years on, it is still the case that there are those in the Anglo-Catholic tradition, those in the charismatic evangelical tradition, and those in between who have different expectations of the Church and the Church's leadership. It's become more difficult to reconcile them, not least because issues like homosexuality and gay marriage have become more salient and cut across all of those lines, so traditional friendships and loyalties are more difficult. And that is why whoever succeeds Justin will have a uniquely difficult task, a task compounded by the fact that, of course, the broader Anglican communion, particularly in those areas where the Anglican Church is particularly strong in Africa, will be looking on with a degree of consternation and regret to what has happened.
Well, obviously, there's never a good time for an Archbishop of Canterbury to resign, but it's hard to think of a worse time than this, because Justin Welby is at the centre of a terrific firestorm throughout the Anglican Communion, of which he's the leader, some 80 million people, because he has essentially decided to take an extremely liberal line on the subject of homosexuality, which, as we know from every Christian denomination, is the third rail, as it were. And so there is, I think, particularly after this week's events, going to be the feeling of an institution that's just falling apart at the seams.
Well, I think it is the case that those charged with finding a successor to Justin and those who are in leadership positions in the Church of England are going through an agonising period at the moment. I think it's important to bear in mind that there are still hundreds of parishes where you have wonderful priests, vicars, and ministers who are doing a great job. You mentioned Marcus Walker earlier. Anyone who visits his church on a Sunday morning will see it full with people from every age and background. There are many churches like that. So there is a vitality still within many parts of the Church of England, but you have this situation where the institutional leadership, the corporate leadership, doesn't seem to be in a position to provide the support required for those who are really making a difference on the ground.
And versions of this crisis, this drama, are being played out in churches throughout the Western world. And here's one point that I really insist on making, if I may, which is that the Catholic Church has obviously been hit harder than any other organisations by allegations and horrific incidents of abuse. As we speak, Pope Francis has been accused, even though it's not been widely reported, of infinitely more serious complicity in sexual abuse carried out by his allies than anything levelled at the Archbishop of Canterbury. And the fact that it goes largely unreported and uninvestigated, I find an inexplicable scandal. It doesn't augur well for the future of Christianity, but then I suppose Christians would say that the gates of hell will never prevail against their church.
Yes, I think that's right. And I think there have been worse crises in the past for both the Roman Catholic Church and for the Anglican Church, and they have come through strengthened by the faith of those in the pews, and that is where churches must ultimately draw their strength from their worshippers, from the whole congregation, rather than from those who may be leading it at any one time. But I would say just two other things, Damian. One is I hope that you will write more in The Spectator in weeks to come about the crises which are facing the Roman Catholic Church. And it is also the case that in this week's Spectator, Will Moore, our features editor, is looking at what the next steps are for the Church of England as it seeks to recover and repair itself after this traumatic week.
Michael Gove, thank you very much.
Thank you, Damian. Thank you.